So my workshop is about how to write a fairy tale retelling and make it your own and effectively make it original and creative. If you've ever read my book, you'll know it's a fairy tale retelling. It is From the Mouths of Sirens, which is a fairy tale retelling of The Little Mermaid. And if you haven't read it, I won't spoil it or give anything away. I thought about what I wanted to do. This is kind of the first thing that came to mind, just because I have experience with writing fairy tale retellings. I did write a book before this. It wasn't ever published, but it was a fairy tale retelling of Rapunzel. And I've always loved fairy tale retelling, so I figured this is something I can speak on. And I'm definitely not an expert by any means, but it's something that I feel passionate about. So without further ado, let's get started. And if you're not writing a fairy tale retelling, and if you don't have any plans on writing a fairy tale retelling, I still think that what we're going to talk about can be applicable to your writing as well. So let's get started. Oh, and I also want to mention I am a self-published author, and I self-published my debut book, From the Mouths of Sirens, this year. So this is really exciting. This is the first workshop that I've ever done. So thank you for being here. All right. So fairy tales, why do we love them? Well, if you're like me, you grew up on fairy tales, and fairy tales were your understanding of storytelling. I remember getting a lot of fairy tales from the library, and just basically kind of growing up on them. My grandmother had fairy tales, and I would read at her house. And so I just have a lot of fond memories, and I think that really speaks to the nostalgic nature of fairy tales. I think that fairy tales really speak to human truth and human existence. So, we have these fond memories of reading them. And of course, most of us grew up with Disney movies. And so there's something very nostalgic and familiar about fairy tales. But I think at its core, they're familiar because they communicate truths of human existence that we can all kind of relate to. When you think about fairy tales and folklore, a lot of them were passed down and have become staples of culture in many parts of the world. And fairy tales kind of give us an appreciation for the past, but are also extremely relevant to real life. The elements in fairy tales, like be careful what you wish for, or good versus evil, are very relevant to our daily lives. Like even if we, aren't fighting evil witches or magical curses, overcoming struggles and fighting for good is something very real. And we see characters struggle and endure in fairy tales, and we kind of learn perseverance right alongside the characters. And then Roseanne said, do you find that when you say you write fairy tale retellings, everyone assumes it's a spin on the Disney movie? Yes. I mean, I associate a lot of fairy tales with Disney. I think especially with The Little Mermaid, like even as I was kind of researching for this presentation and looking into it a little bit more, the first thing that pops up when you type in The Little Mermaid is the 1989 Disney movie. It's not even the Hans Christian Andersen version. So I do think sometimes people like automatically imagine the Disney versions, which actually are retelling as well. So, but we have so many fairy tale retellings that I think that we all have enjoyed before. And it's interesting because I've gotten some comments of people saying, why did you retell this story? Like, you know, people already have the original, so why do you need to retell it? That's so unoriginal, or this has been done before, so why does yours matter? And those are very valid questions. So why are fairy tale retellings important, and how are they original? So I don't think that fairy tale retellings are a cop out, or that they are cheap storytelling. I actually think quite the opposite. I think that fairy tale retelling can actually give a really unique opportunity for authors to spin the narrative in a really creative way that only they could do. Fairy tale retellings can be just as original and unique as stories that are not retelling. Firstly, as an author, you're bringing a unique and fresh perspective to the story. You know, you may have a different background than the character from the original story. You could be bringing elements of a different culture to the story. You could be twisting the narrative in a way that only you could do. So don't discount your own creativity. Secondly, retelling a beloved and well-known story takes courage, because obviously that comparison automatically comes to mind. Everyone knows the original story of The Little Mermaid, and so I know that parallels and comparisons will be made, and it kind of takes guts to revamp and reimagine such a tried and true story, because you know those comparisons are going to be coming. And I know this has probably been said so many times before, but all stories are connected and recycled because the same human truths are at the core of them all. I've read some insanely creative and original works that still have themes of good and evil and other fairy tales. You know, The Little Mermaid isn't the only story with a bargain between a princess and a witch, and countless other stories follow the same arcs as be careful what you wish for, make mistaken identities, or breaking curses. And that's kind of the beauty of writing your own interpretation of your own reimagining. And I don't think that, you know, like every single story is a copy of another one, obviously. But I do think there's something to be said that there are so many stories with the same tropes, and to say like only fairy tale retellings are stories that like are just recycled, I think would be inaccurate. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, the cold medicine making my brain a little foggy. But anywho, I've included some of my favorite fairy tale retellings right here. Skin of the Sea is a Little Mermaid retelling. House of Salt and Sorrows is a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses, to be confused with the Barbie 12 Dancing Princesses. I don't know if that's too niche of a reference, but I love Barbie movies. And then, of course, The Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer. I love those sci-fi retellings. There's Cinderella and Rapunzel and Snow White and the Goose Girl. I love Shannon Hale. I'm definitely a Shannon Hale girly. I grew up and I checked out her books from the library. And was Karen. What all these have, I kind of favorites, and I wanted to think of what do these all have in common, and why are they such good examples? Well, all of these effectively retell the original by maintaining the core elements of the story while simultaneously and creatively reimagining them into their own unique stories. I'm so sorry, my dog is like chewing on a toy in the corner, so I'm sorry if you can hear that. Calvin. are really quiet throughout the day, and as soon as I'm talking or I'm in a meeting, they just immediately start making noise. So I'm so sorry about that. But back to the stories that I'm reading everyone's comments. Fellow Shannon Hale stan. Yes, we love to see it. Anyway, back to this. Sorry. While all of these kind of tell their own unique stories, I think the bones of the original story are definitely there, but these authors have truly made it their own because they don't follow the original story so closely that it's boring or predictable. I think that's a real danger of retellings, is sometimes if you follow it too closely and you kind of follow the narrative so closely that you kind of know what's going to happen and it's really predictable and you kind of already have an idea of where it's going, it can lose the audience's focus and attention. But I don't think any of these fall into that trap. And I'm definitely not comparing my book to some of these because I think they're much better. But mine is definitely a retelling that I wanted to throw in there. So getting started, what can you do if you want to do a retelling, and what can you kind of look for? Firstly, you should know your source and research other renditions. Also, if my audio is going in and out, please comment and let me know because I'm very paranoid about that. I think that by knowing your source and being familiar with the original, you can kind of see what the original did well, what you disliked about the original, what elements do you want to leave behind, like, you know, what parts of the story that did you not really like that you don't really want to, you know, continue. You know, what elements do you want to adopt in your version? And then when you consider other renditions, what other retellings exist out there already? You don't want to accidentally copy someone's idea. I mean, that's, you know, that seems obvious, but it's always good to know what else is out there already. You know, if you consider the market as well, you know, what's missing from the market, what interpretation would you like to see that you haven't seen before? You know, where can you kind of contribute and fill in the gaps? Those are all really valuable questions, I think. And I think that's kind of ironic because a lot of the Little Mermaid interpretations exist, and I chose one of the most popular ones, but that's neither here nor there. So what are your favorite parts of the original? That's something else that you should consider. What did you like about these parts? You know, if it's the love story of the original, what specifically about the love story? What parts of the love story do you want to see translated in your version? This will kind of help you get a grasp on what you're trying to achieve with your own story. If you love the trope of found family because you yourself value unconditional love and friendship, you'll know what to shoot for in your own story. So kind of considering why you love those tropes will really help you tell a really effective story. Hopefully that makes sense. But after you kind of look at those elements, how can you achieve an original retelling? So, you know, we've gone through the old version, the original version, we've considered some of these already existing ones. So let's get started and write an actual story. So how can we do that? Well, with my little bubble, not sure if you can see that. So number one, what themes, tropes, or ideas do you want to uphold from the original story? you can kind of start thinking about how to communicate these ideas in your own version. Maybe you want to carry on this mistaken identity trope from the original. I'm sure we can all think of examples of that. If you have the mistaken identity trope, maybe the princess was mistaken for a pauper or something. What kind of identity should the princess have in your story? Maybe she's an assassin or a witch or an apprentice of some kind. You can still communicate a specific theme, like a mistaken identity, but rewrite the original narrative. And then ask yourself, what do you want to communicate to your audience that the original didn't? Why is your version meaningful and significant? For example, in the original Little Mermaid, we didn't really get the prince's perspective. And my book does have the prince's perspective. We didn't really have a taste of the actual world. I'm talking about the original Hans Christian Andersen version. There wasn't really much about the actual world that it was taking place in, but I think the broader world is very much a part of my story. In my version, core politics in the world are like very much at play. And at the core of my story, I wanted to communicate that the two main characters are not as different as they originally believe themselves to be. And I wanted them to kind of find common ground. And in the original, I don't really think the prince has an arc, really. And I all that to say, I wanted to communicate to the audience a new and unique take. But then at the same time, I did have some aspects that I kept the same. I kind of asked myself, what do I want to keep the same and how can I modify it? So in writing your retelling, just ask, what aspects do you want to keep the same and what do you want to uphold and carry on? If the original had a great sacrifice or something, who or what do you want to sacrifice? In the original, was there a spell being broken at midnight? Maybe in your version, you have a different kind of spell, and the ramifications are different. Or maybe the spell is broken in a much different way than the original. There are like countless possibilities and endless possibilities that you can twist these tropes and make them your own, And so I find that that's really helpful to, write these down. What did you like? What did you dislike? Things of that nature. Let's move on to in practice. So what does this look like in real life? I put a little picture of my characters over on the side here because I pretty much look at that picture every single day in my life and I love them. That's Rook, the guy with the wings, and that's Saoirse, who is My Little Mermaid. So I just wanted to pick apart some aspects of my story and demonstrate kind of what we've been talking about already, like how it looks in practice. The Sea Witch definitely plays a role in my story. I always really thought that the Sea Witch character was really interesting and really compelling, and so I definitely wanted to incorporate that in my story. And so the Sea Witch obviously makes a bargain with her, so that's still in my story. But rather than giving up her tail for legs and her voice, she actually gives away her powers. So she actually like controls the sea, and she gives away this magical pearl. I won't spoil it too much. And then she makes a bargain to kill the prince. So she's still giving up something and still making this bargain in exchange for something. But I kind of twisted it, if that makes sense. And I'm a sucker for forbidden bargains. So it was like, obviously I have to do that.
Um, and then obviously the original is one point of view, and in mine there's 2 points of view, and I kind of touched on this earlier, but the prince doesn't really have like a storyline in the original, and so mine is a dual point of view between Rook and Saoirse. And so that's just kind of illustrating how you can take some of the original elements and kind of flip it on its head and add a new perspective, or create an entire world that expands on the characters. And I kind of I did actually spend a lot of time thinking about the ways that I wanted it to be the same and the ways I wanted it to be different. And ultimately, I think mine was successful because the story can kind of stand on its own, and without the Little Mermaid knowledge, or knowledge of the original, you can kind of have its own story, if that makes sense. So yeah, if you want to read my book, you definitely can. But there are so many other retellings out there that do a phenomenal job. So in conclusion, we talked about looking at the market and looking at other people's renditions. But my biggest advice is to have fun. You don't need to compare yourself to other retellings or the original. Ultimately, you're writing this story for yourself. You don't need to outdo the original or make a superior version. It's not a competition. You're allowed to have fun. The whole point of a fairy tale retelling is because you can present your own interpretation and tell a story that only you can tell. I talked about, there's so many other interpretations or so many retellings. Yes, it's helpful to look at those and see what others have written, but you're not out to write the best retelling. It's more about writing your own retelling. So don't get so bogged down by like, I have to make it this way and I have to make it stand out over these other ones. Ultimately, you're having fun with it. And I wrote this story because I grew up on retellings and I've always been drawn to them. I wrote a story that I would want to read and one that I hadn't seen done before, and I've taken ownership of that story and made it my own. I'm reading your messages. Good news, my computer is back and the charger is working. I'm really enjoying your guys' comments. So anyway, have fun and write something you're proud of. You can get really technical with it, and you're comparing your work to, really great renditions of an original story. But have fun and make it your own. And so I was going to go ahead and answer some of your questions. I do have some questions that were already sent in, so I'll start with those. And then if anyone else has questions, you can type it. Okay. What tips do you have for knowing which pieces to keep from the original and what to get rid of? Tips. I think if you read the original, just based off of a personal preference, you'll probably start to figure out what you like and what you don't like. For example, in the original Little Mermaid, she has a lot of sisters and a large family. And in my version, I didn't really want her to have a large family because part of her loss of her family and her trauma from losing a parent motivates her and drives her towards wanting to compete in this competition and I feel like the stakes were kind of higher and she had more of a personal stake. So I'm not sure if that makes sense, but you can kind of customize the story to fit what your character is wanting to accomplish. And some of that looks like leaving behind some of the aspects of the original story, if that makes sense. Do you think it's more difficult to market a retelling, or would you say it's easier? I think it's easier, actually. Well, maybe I don't. I think it's 50-50. I think when you market your book saying, oh, it's a retelling of The Little Mermaid, people automatically kind of know what The Little Mermaid is. And I think sometimes that makes it easier for people to digest and they kind of know what they're looking for. But at the same time, if you don't like The Little Mermaid, then you won't pick up the book. And I think it's its own story, and I definitely think that it could stand on its own. And I think the more you read it, the more you realize it's totally different. But on face value, if someone's like, oh, it's The Little Mermaid, I don't want to read that, then they'll miss out on the original story. But overall, I think it's easier because everyone loves The Little Mermaid. Watch us have like a viewer here who like hates The Little Mermaid. But oh, thank you. Thank you for saying that. If you study the plot beats and create a whole different story around that plot scaffolding, is it still retelling? That's a really good question. I think it's a retelling because at its core, this mermaid, she's not a mermaid, but this sea princess makes a deal with this sea witch and goes to the surface and she interacts with the prince. I don't want to spoil too much, but at its heart, I was intentionally retelling The Little Mermaid. I don't think I, went out and said, well, I just, I took inspiration from The Little Mermaid, but I'm just going to write a whole new story. I did set out to write a retelling. So I do think mine is a retelling, but I'm not sure if that makes sense. Question. How would you write a blurb for a retelling? Well, I can answer that because I have my book right here. So in my blurb, I did say that the very first like hook or description of the book, it's a dark reimagining of The Little Mermaid from the Mouths of Sirens is the first installment in a compelling new YA fantasy series. So from the very first line, I did say it was a retelling of The Little Mermaid. But given that first sentence, I kind of go into how it is its own story. And I did a little paragraph about her actual story, and it's way different than the original Little Mermaid. But next question. How do you maneuver not trespassing on Disney's intellectual property? Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Disney owns The Little Mermaid, but I could be completely wrong. And I probably wouldn't be able to speak on that very much. I don't think I'm trespassing on Disney's property, but what am I working on now? Okay, this will be my one of my last questions. I'm so sorry, my voice is like not pretty to listen to right now. Right now, I'm actually working on a YA fantasy that I hope to finish by the end of the year. It's actually not like the same kind of high fantasy that I've typically written. It's actually, it reminds me of kind of like the Victorian era in England and like Howl's Moving Castle. And it's like a murder mystery. So I don't have a title for it yet, but I'm very excited about that story. It's definitely different than a fairy tale retelling. And interestingly enough, I've kind of only written fairy tale retellings until this book, or at least seriously written fairy tale retellings. And so it's a very different experience. Maybe in the future I'll do a workshop on that, but it's not even published yet. Let me keep looking for all of them. Oh, okay, good. The original stories are open source. Okay, that's what I thought. I don't have a character named Flounder in my book. Yeah, there we go. Okay, we're good. So I'm not going to be sued. Okay, so yes, Howl's Moving Castle inspired. Yes, it's I definitely did start thinking of this story while I was watching Howl's Moving Castle. So anyway, do you guys have any other questions for me or anything else you want to talk about? I really appreciate all of your guys' patience while my video was being terrible. It really means a lot to me that you'd be here. I've done one podcast episode before, but other than that, I've never done like a workshop or anything. So it really means a lot to me that you would want to sit in on what I have to say. Sorry, I'm reading everyone's comments. I'm really bad at multitasking. Thank you guys for listening to me. I am on Instagram, so if you want to message me or if you have any other feedback or thoughts that you want to share with me, you can definitely do that. Thank you. Thank you. Have you read most of the original fairy tales? Yeah, I would say I have. I was probably reading really dark Grimm's fairy tales when I was way too young, but I definitely would say I've read most of them. I probably wouldn't be able to tell you what exactly happens in them because it's been so long, but I remember I have a lot of vivid memories of checking out these books from the library, um, like Grimm's fairy tales, but also like King Arthur stories and Knights of the Round Table. What would be your favorite retelling of a fairy tale? My favorite retelling would probably be the Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer, which I kind of spoke about in the presentation. But anyway, thank you guys for all your kind words. I really appreciate it. If you end up writing a fairy tale retelling and you publish it and become famous, you can credit me as your inspiration. I'm kidding. It's very weird that I can't hear you guys laughing at my jokes, but I really wish you all the best of luck and have a great rest of your Indie WriterFest and enjoy all the rest of the panels. Have a good morning if you're in the UK time zone, and have a great night if you're in the US. But I'm going to end it now. And if you have any other questions, let me know. So, bye, guys. I hope you have a great rest of your evening.